Hello! How are you? Hope you're well. I don't think you've seen this mug before. Look at it. Look how epic it is. I'm starting to realise that collecting mugs might be a special interest of mine. I love it. What I want to talk to you about today is the many positive things that I experience as an autistic person. And this is really important because of a lot of our stories and the mainstream perspective of both disabilities and autism is purely negative. Obviously there's some movement here, and obviously I acknowledge that being disabled is very difficult at times, and that's different for every person. And so this doesn't negate that, this doesn't cancel that reality out. And what's important is to diversify this story and this narrative. And it's really important for a number of reasons. Firstly, it allows disabled people to recognize self-understanding and self-reassurance. I think if it's only a negative story that we're telling and reproducing, that can be really difficult for those people that are those identities. It will help with valuing oneself if a more balanced story is told around disabilities. Secondly, it is actually culturally more correct to have a more diverse story and understanding of disabilities as well. The colonial and the eugenics idea of disabilities being negative is something highly problematic, and it creates a lot of the ableism that still exists in society today, within people, within organisations, within groups of people, within families, friendship groups, you name it, relationships, romantic relationships. It exists and persists in those fields because it comes from a history of eugenics and a history of coloniality. You may know that eugenics originated in England, and the whole history is pretty horrific. So we need to do a lot of work to undo that background. Secondly, with the colonial aspect that I talked about, across the world and historically there's been lots of different perspectives on disability. Ones that are generally more positive than our, and by our I mean Anglo-American, ideas of disability that have been globalized and so are understood throughout the world now. What we find when we only have a negative idea of this field is that that's a very colonial idea that is dominating the mainstream. Whilst I'm talking about decolonization, I would like to acknowledge my position as a white person who is British, who has benefited from colonial practices, and that I support Indigenous efforts of reclaiming land, reparations and sovereignty across the world. I think acknowledging our privileges is really important because a lot of this includes Indigenous knowledge, and I would really encourage you to invest your time and energy and money into investing in Indigenous campaigns, information, knowledge, and prioritising people who are proponents of those fields and forms of activism, and really centralising their voices. Oh, I really want to show you this mug, like a lot, but it's just, I have to do this and then, ooh, my wrist actually hurt from I have a disability, that's relevant. I have a disability around chronic pain with my joints, which I only discovered recently, so woo! So it's quite a celebratory thing to be diagnosed, even though it might sound like unusual, or maybe people don't understand, but it's really difficult if you don't know what's going on with you, and sometimes having helpful services is quite difficult. So I'm super pleased that I've been diagnosed with a disability that now I can understand and navigate. Woo! So it's called hypermobility spectrum disorder, and it's statistically common to happen alongside autism. So at the moment my wrists are really hurting, which is very frustrating when you're trying to do work and when you're trying to use your laptop and your phone, because obviously it limits your ability to do those things, or you do those things and you're in a lot of pain. So I've been trying to take it easy and having a bit of a break. So yeah, I think I'm really happy that I understand what's happening now. What I want to start off with is that, of course, I enjoy being autistic because that is me. It seems quite bizarre to me to not celebrate people and diversity, and I'm a strong believer of the social model of disability, which argues, and there's a lot of evidence to support this, it's now becoming common understanding at least, that it is society that disables individuals, and because society is designed with the idea of a typical conventional able-bodied, and by that I mean someone who's able-bodied in the conventional terms, and someone who is neurotypical as well. So those restrictions and that frame of thinking really informs a lot of our behaviours and policies and practices and legislation as well that is around how we function day to day in our society. There's a lot of work to be done here, and I'm really interested in areas like disability feminist studies, disability studies and neurodiversity studies. Those fields have always really interested me, and now I know why. Well, I mean, obviously it's a part of intersectional thinking and ideas, and equality thinking and ideas, and now later in life I've actually found out that I'm also disabled and autistic. So yeah, I think there's been quite a few reasons why it's been important to me. I've also grown up around a lot of disability and neurodiversity, so it's kind of second nature for me to value those experiences. Why wouldn't I celebrate my neurodiversity? Yes, it can be challenging sometimes, but it is mainly the culture around me that makes it challenging. You can tell that isn't really about me. There's also issues with being a neurotypical person. Another point that I'd like to celebrate about my personal experience of being autistic is my propensity to be honest and direct and literal. So that's quite a common trait amongst autistic people. This really contributes to a lot of autistic people's ability of being able to cut through all of the garbage and all of the dress up and all of the basically ridiculous norms that exist in our society around certain things, some of which are really damaging and unhelpful and not okay. There's a lot of assumptions that are the mainstream, being normal is great and fitting in these norms is really healthy, but that hasn't produced the kind of society that we're happy living in, as statistics show. When I'm in social situations and I can see all of these quite unusual, to be honest, ways people are interacting with each other, it's actually quite helpful to have a different perspective and a different insight on these norms, and that obviously feeds into different areas as well. So I might come up with quite to the point and effective strategies and initiatives and things that actually work in practice, because the kind of stereotypes around logical thinking and autism, it relates to this common trait that many of us have, because and I don't want to get too bogged down in very simplistic ideas of the rational mind or the emotional mind. That's not what we're talking about here, because for me logical action includes emotional and empathetic experience and facts, and usually those things correspond anyway. Being honest means a lot of the time that you get straight to the point of things and you cut through all the trash, and whilst that is socially frowned upon, that to me is becoming more vital and more important and essential in our culture, because if we keep just talking trash about environmental protection but not actually doing anything, that could spell out real problems for us. And the same with equality initiatives and the kind of field that I'm in. If we just talk trash about equality practices and don't actually do anything effective, then we're talking about people's real lives here that are impacted by bias and discrimination. That's why it's really great to just be really straightforward about such things. And I think a lot of autistic people are informed by facts and that is really great. So I don't really understand what the problem is there. So yeah, I think obviously there can be nuances to how we have conversations, and I think there's definitely ways that we can learn. We as a culture, not just autistic people, can learn how to frame things in ways that are going to be most successful, and that's something that everyone can learn as well. And at the same time, I think this kind of insight should be much better rewarded, because if for nothing else, if for none of the other reasons I've just mentioned, the very fact that autistic people are prone to this kind of perspective means that if we don't reward and if we don't support and appreciate this kind of information, that in effect is also an ableist practice. I mean, it would be wonderful, in my view, if people were more honest. Isn't it a bit concerning that being honest is actually a socially frowned upon trait? So I think there's a lot of great things that can be learnt from autistic perspectives, including what I've just outlined and emphasised. Great. This is my editing. Nadia, edit here. Here is some cropping time. My next point is that I personally really enjoy stimming, and stimming it can be expressed in different ways, but it's a process that many autistic people use to help manage their input of information. So because the sensory overload could be quite a lot and can overwhelm some autistic people, stimming is a way to manage that information, and I think that's really wonderful. For me, I get a real buzz when I'm stimming as well. So when I'm really excited, I might clap my hands like this. Yeah, how great is that? And and also I rock a lot of the time like this, and especially if I'm listening to music, but sometimes if I'm feeling excited or anxious or I do that. And there can be some negative stims, but thankfully many of us can learn how to stop doing those negative stims. So hitting one's head is a stereotype that can happen as well. I had some stims where I had to clench this part of my body repeatedly, and because I have joint chronic pain, that really hurt me after a while. So those are some examples of stims that aren't great, but there are some stims that are really enjoyable and fun. So I have a lot of singing stims and dancing stims as well. So I will start singing a lot, or I'll start dancing a lot, and it can be with music or it can be without music. And it's just about movement, and a lot of the time it just looks like normal singing or dancing, but it's actually a stimming process. So I can start to feel really happy, and it's almost like a spiritual experience for me. So that's really enjoyable. Also, I do some words that are stimming words. So I say wow a lot, and I also say yay a lot. And for me, I think those are really fantastic things to say. I'm just like, wow. Well, there you go. Why wouldn't I say those things? Because they can apply to many subject areas, many things. And it can be when I'm excited, I can say them when I'm anxious, but that's what stims are. So you do that to manage the input of information, as I said. And so when you're talking about something, I often get very engrossed in that subject that you're referring to, say. And so saying wow is actually quite an appropriate thing to say in those circumstances. But many of us have been taught to reduce our stims because they're not socially acceptable. And when we do that, managing reality, for me, becomes much harder because I'm not using things to manage myself. It's actually really great to be able to stim in healthy ways, and it's a great part of my everyday life and something I enjoy, but it's also a coping mechanism that works. If you restrict people from stimming, then it can really reduce their ability to manage day to day and to have a more enjoyable, for me it would really reduce the enjoyability in my life, not being able to do those things. And yet when people do stim publicly or in the workplace or in social groups, and or in family groups, they can be really outcast or ostracized or humiliated, made fun of, seen as someone that is easily picked on. So it can be a real issue. It's like a real paradoxical situation where it would really help, certainly me, to be able to stim as much as I want to and just enjoy myself and just be left alone by mean people. And yet, you know, that's not socially accepted, and it's certainly not accepted in the workplace either. You can really start to tell and see why there are some issues here. When I learned more about my neurodiversity, I allowed myself to stim more, but then I experienced more and more problems as a result. So it really sucks, to be honest, that paradox exists. But I really hope that that's going to change soon. I think it's important to just let people do what they want. So I also have synesthesia, which means that music can sometimes be a visual pattern for me. And when I stim in those ways, the singing and dancing, then that increases my synesthesia as well. And that's really beautiful and amazing to experience. And I'm like, this is great. And I thought like everyone had that as well, but apparently not. And you can understand why that might be such a awesome thing to experience. And synesthesia is also statistically high with autistic people as well. There's a link there as well. So those are really parts of me that I really appreciate and enjoy. So my next point is good communication. So against, again, the stereotype, research around autism shows that autistic people are really good at socializing with each other. Obviously this is like broad strokes, but what the research has found is these patterns. And neurotypical people are good at socializing with each other, but it's when those things are crossed that there exist issues here. And so one of the problems with the stereotypes around autism and other disabilities is that they are not nuanced and they are not informed by data and people's lived experiences, and that they're really oversimplistic. So the kind of stereotypes that autistic people aren't very good at communicating, these are all based on a neurotypical perspective. And now with this research, you can see why that is ableist in nature and why it's prioritizing, how it's prioritizing a neurotypical standpoint means that it sees autistic experience here as more negative and less capable. However, from my own experience, what I found is that the issue has been neurotypical social norms and neurotypical forms of communication. And so what has happened with myself and many other people is that we have learnt really thoroughly neurotypical ways of communicating, and many of us have certain scripts of ways to navigate different types of conversations. And then we get into a place where actually we are really good at communicating, including in the neurotypical world. And yes, there might still be some difficulties. Many neurotypical people have difficulties with communication, even between themselves. And so I find that I actually have a really high understanding of communication strategies and communication processes, whereas many neurotypical people don't have that knowledge. And so you get to a point, an ironic point almost, because of where we start from, that a lot of us are actually really good at communication skills and at understanding neurotypical culture, understanding human and neurotypical behaviours. So it kind of links into special interests as well. But I think what I want to emphasise in this point is that many of us become really good at the areas that we struggle with precisely because of that struggle. When me and a lot of my autistic friends are together, it's some of the best communication I've ever seen between people, because this is obviously broad strokes again, I'm just talking in general terms from my own experience, but we're just very clear, we're just very, we're often interested in big talk, we're often talking about really important things, and it produces really supportive, honest, caring, and relationships that have no ambiguity, relationships that you don't doubt if there's hidden toxicity there because you just talk about it and you'd solve it. It's just much easier, I find, and there's a lot that neurotypicals can learn from that kind of interaction. Yes, there are struggles here, and yes, obviously there's a lot of diversity within autistic people, and there's people that are sometimes or all the time non-verbal, and that is the case. And at the same time, there are many of us who experience a lot of diversity within communication and our skills around these areas. And so there are different levels of support needs across the autistic spectrum. And I think we have to acknowledge that difference. And what I'm trying to highlight here is that these experiences are really important and they happen to dominate a lot of the stereotypes, which isn't the case for all of us. You can see how the stereotype of bad communication applied to all of us can be difficult. I don't really experience that. It actually makes us really effective communicators, and communication has been, I work in communications, so it's just like, I don't know, I just find it, I love it, I find it really interesting, and I think that is one of the benefits from the struggles of working and living in a society that it doesn't really teach people how to communicate well. It doesn't, and I have had more issues with that because of being a neurodiverse person, and therefore I have learned more and kind of felt like I've really thrived in this field. Another point that I enjoy about my experience as an autistic person is a high level of effective empathy. You may have heard of the stereotypes that it's wrong, that autistic people aren't very empathetic, and for many of us that there couldn't be something more. It's so false. In fact, the opposite is true for many of us. Yes, again, there is diversity here, and there are lots of different reasons why that is the case. Research shows that many of us have a high level, higher than neurotypicals, of effective empathy. Effective empathy is having first-person empathy for someone that you're talking to or someone that you're interacting with. Whilst this might be seen as a bit of a pain, the reality is it's really great, because the more empathetic I am about other people, the more that I can do my equality work, which is I work in equality and communications work. So for me, it's actually really pivotal in my work to care about the experiences of others. So it's really difficult for me to be cruel to other people because of what I'm talking about, which is great. Isn't that amazing? You can really easily see how effective empathy can be really helpful. I have effective empathy around plants and animals and the people around me. And so that means it's really difficult to mistreat those things and creatures and people. And that is a real gift that I think should be mainstreamed and prioritised culturally as well. You can tell there's a lot to learn from autistic perspectives and neurodiverse perspectives. So some of the research that talks about autistic people having so-called lower levels of empathy, it goes both ways, you see. So autistic people spend a lot of their time trying to learn about neurotypicals' perspectives, and feelings and insights. Everything is all based on us becoming more like neurotypical people. But that does not happen the other way around. Very minimally, if you have people that are really interested in being more neurodiverse in their approaches, then and only then do you get people trying to do that the other way around. But still, it's not for like their entire lives, whereas for autistic people, our entire lives are based on trying to learn about neurotypicals, everything, right? So that we fit in. That is a huge disparity, obviously, in terms of energy, effort and time, which neurotypicals don't have to do. And also, it means that the research is biased in relation to those perspectives towards autistic people, when your notion of what empathy is based on an autistic person's ability to be empathetic towards neurotypicals, but not the other way around. Do you understand? So what about all the neurotypical lack of empathy towards autistic perspectives and experiences? Surely that should be marked down on their empathy charts, right? The fact that we're in this situation in our culture, which is ableist towards people like me, shows a lack of empathy towards people like me. There's a huge amount of questions around this type of research, which is pretty problematic. And yeah, in my experience, has been really inaccurate. I think some of the most empathetic people I know are autistic people. It can be difficult because our culture does not necessarily reward. I love my little tweaks when I talk. Even though our culture does not necessarily reward like effective empathy, I know that it is important, and I know that I really admire and appreciate it in other people as well. Great, so I'm going to end it there, just because I could go on for a long time. And stay tuned for more neurodiverse updates and insights. And thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you. Please remember to subscribe and to like this video if you enjoyed it. I really hope to make videos and share information as a part of my living, and it's really important to me. And please share it as much as you can if you know people that will love this content. And thank you again, you're the best.